Welcome to Believing the Word with author and pastor Dan Shunk. This program is a ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
The chapter 1 of Daniel is all about seeing a believer, Daniel, and how he lives in an unbelieving world, yet he's able to do it in an undefiled manner. That really lines up with the time of the church age. You know, here we are as believers living in the world around us, an unbelieving world, and our goal is to not defile ourselves as we live for Christ.
What happens when everything familiar is stripped away and every pressure pushes you to compromise? Daniel 1 introduces 4 young Jewish men taken captive to Babylon who refuse to let their circumstances define their faith. They choose obedience over convenience, trusting that honoring God is more important than fitting in. Their courage reminds us that even in a culture that opposes God, faithful living brings His favor. Join us as we discover 4 ways we can show our commitment to Christ in the midst of corruption. Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Daniel as he continues his message, Commitment Among Corruption.
Opening up a fresh new book, so that means I do have to give you a little bit of an introduction to get us going in the book before we start reading. It's 12 chapters in the book of Daniel, and as I alluded to earlier, we're actually very unusual for the Old Testament. We're actually going to take them one at a time because they're each very unique individual chapters. For the first 6 particularly, they're chronologically right through Daniel's life, and they're each a different moment in his life with very different events happening. And so let me just set the stage just a little bit here. The Babylonian siege of Jerusalem is about to happen. You might remember that the Israelites were oppressed by Babylon in kind of 3 waves. It started in 605 BC and then 597 BC before Jerusalem was finally sacked in 586 BC. And Daniel was part of the captivity that was taken. In fact, he was part of the first wave of the captivity that was taken in 605 BC. And most scholars would say Daniel was born right about 620 BC. So he's really just a young child at the time that he is taken, maybe 15 years old, when he is deported and taken to Babylon. And so he lives from this time period of the Babylonians really right up until Babylon is taken over by the Medo-Persians later on, around 530 BC. So that's the time period where we're writing. One of the interesting things I want you to know about this book, even before we start reading it, is that this book is much greater than just a writing. I say that because in the Jewish collection of their Bible, they will put this book in the section called writings, not with the prophets. And that's very important to note because if the things in this book are true, it's prophecy. The only way you could get around calling this book a prophecy is if you date this book and you say that this book was written in the 200s, that is the 3rd century BC. That is the only way you could get around this being prophecy. Many skeptics will look at this book and say, well, this was written after the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the Maccabee revolt and all of those things. And so they try to say, well, the prophecy in this book is fulfilled and this is just a writing. Well, there's many other things in this book that are well beyond the time period of the Maccabees that make it prophetic anyway. And so we don't believe that there was some pseudo-Daniel that came along and wrote in his name centuries later. This is absolutely authentic. In fact, we have a good attestation from somebody that I tend to trust. Do you know this guy who talked about Daniel as a prophet? His name is Jesus in the New Testament. Christ himself said that you should think about the things that were written by Daniel the prophet. So I think that's pretty good indication that what we're reading is prophetic. Christ was talking in the Olivet Discourse about things that are coming in the end, and he mentioned the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. And so we have lots of good evidence and reasons to believe that this was the real Daniel at the real time period of the Babylonians writing these things and saying many of these things yet to come. If you put a theme to the whole book of Daniel, these 12 chapters, I think it would be this. You would have to say that this book is about God's power to bring Israel through the kingdoms of this world to exaltation. More than other books, this tiny book of Daniel, though it talks about all of the world kingdoms and nations right down through time, the focus is still on how the Lord is going to bring Israel through it all and then establish them in the end in the kingdom, in the 1,000-year millennial reign. And so, yes, it talks about all of these global events, but as it affects Israel. So don't ever lose track of that. I mentioned also earlier how it's interesting that this book is both so personally devotional with the personal things that Daniel and his friends go through, but yet at the same time, it's so amazingly global. It talks about such major earth-changing events. It's just absolutely fascinating in that fashion, that you can come to Daniel with a mindset to say, I want to understand what God says about human history and the kingdoms of this world. And you can get very heady and theological, and it's amazing. And you can also come to Daniel another time and you could say, Lord, just teach me. Teach my heart how to live right. And you could use this book equally powerfully for that. I just love that dual nature of Daniel, where it speaks to these deep things of the world and God's plan, and yet it's one of the most devotional of the prophets, as short as it is, just these 12 chapters. And so let me read just a little bit more. I'm going to let me read a little bit, period. I'm going to read just the first 2 verses to kind of set us up a little bit more of an introduction. So let me read verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So if you remember some of the background history, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't even king yet when he first came and attacked Jerusalem in 605 BC. It was actually his father, Neopalazar, that was the king at the time. And Nebuchadnezzar was sent to destroy the Egyptians at Carchemish. That was a major battle in world history, which would be north of Israel. And he was going to head next to besiege Jerusalem in 605. And while he came to Jerusalem, there was word of his father's death, and so he just took some captives like Daniel and headed back to Babylon. And so that's the reason. If you've ever wondered, like, well, why did Babylon come 3 times? Well, it's because the first 2 times they came, things distracted them in global affairs, and they had to pull out for other reasons. But the 3rd time Babylon came is when they finally wiped out Jerusalem. I mean, if you think about it from a world stage point of view, Babylon wasn't really worried about Jerusalem. Although it was a tough little city to tackle, they were worried about Egypt. They were worried about the Egyptian forces all around, and that is what ended up moving Babylon's forces at different times. And so Daniel gets taken captive in 605 BC, taken into Babylon. This is the time period. Verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, that is, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, of course, that's Babylon, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Usually, when an enemy like Babylon or someone else, when they would attack, they would like to take their enemies' gods to show dominance. That's what they did. They literally went and took the statues, whether it was the statue of Zeus or whatever statue, Dagon, and they would capture those things to show their superiority over these gods. You might remember the case where the Ark of the Covenant was taken by the Philistines. Do you remember that? And not only was that the Ark giving the Philistines a hard time and hemorrhoids and everything else, literally, but it also says then their God in their temple actually, I think it fell off the wall and it was chopped in pieces and things like that. And so they looked at that as like, what's going on? If something could touch the statue of our God. And so that's what these nations would look to do. They would look to go and take the actual images and the idols of the gods. Well, Israel didn't have any. And so Babylon here has to go into the temple, and they took some of the vessels from the temple at this time. Of course, again, remember, they didn't destroy the temple until they did the final desecration in 586 BC. As Israel begins their subjugation and then ultimate destruction, it really seems like during this time period, right here, starting in 605 BC, it just seems like Satan turns his attention to other places in the world. This time period is a very fascinating time period to look at in world history, this 600 mark BC. I mean, it's the rise of Confucius, Buddha, many false religions that are still here today began in this very time as Israel's starting to go into their captivity. And even for the 70 years that Israel is in captivity, a lot of these false prophets rise. I just think that's absolutely fascinating. Sometimes we think that like Satan is somehow like God. He's like everywhere at all times. Not the case. He's not like that. He's in one place at a time. And I think it's interesting that during the time that Israel's in captivity and they're really subdued, Satan is out keeping busy. He's doing things around the world. So just a fascinating time period as Israel's going into this captivity in Babylon. And so Daniel is taken. Many of the young people in Israel are taken to Babylon. And I know this is small on the screen here, and maybe you can catch some of this, maybe you can catch some of this later on, but I wanted to give you an outline of the book. This book breaks very, very nicely into two halves. The first 6 chapters of Daniel, they're not only chronological, but I believe they perfectly mirror the end times scenario. I just want to give you a little bit of an understanding of what I'm trying to say in detail. Daniel chapter 1 through 6, the different accounts, these different stories we're going to go through, they sort of compare this way. Let's first kind of remind ourselves of what the end time scenario is. We are in right now what's called the church age. The scripture also calls it the time of the Gentiles. It's things like Jerusalem will be trodden underfoot until the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And so we're living in that church age. Well, really the next prophetic event is the rapture of the church. And right about the time of the rapture of the church is when the 7-year tribulation is going to start. And that 7-year tribulation, heavily, heavily spoken of here in the book of Daniel, it is a time period that God is focused once again on Israel. It's not focused on the church. We're raptured. We're not here. We're in heaven. That time period is focused on Israel. And we'll get to that in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, specifically why. That the Lord says it in a verse or 3, exactly why that 7-year period of time is going to happen. And we'll get to that as we get to chapter 9 of Daniel. But then right after that 7 years, the second coming, you like white horses? We're coming back on white horses with Jesus at the second coming, okay? I don't even particularly like horses, but I'm still excited for that moment. That's going to be a good time to come back at the second coming. And we'll come back and the Lord will establish a 1,000-year millennial kingdom here on earth. It's after that 1,000-year millennial kingdom that is the great white throne judgment happens. And all those that are unbelievers, everything, even hell and death and everything, gets thrown into the lake of fire. That's separate and different from simply hell. Okay? Now, I know I kind of ran that end time scenario quickly because that's not really our intention for tonight. What I wanted to do was I want you to see how these first 6 chapters of Daniel that are chronological really mirrors that whole scenario. We're going to look at chapter 1 tonight in Daniel, and the chapter 1 of Daniel is all about seeing a believer, Daniel, and how he lives in an unbelieving world, yet he's able to do it in an undefiled manner. That really lines up with the time of the church age. Here we are as believers living in the world around us, an unbelieving world, and our goal is to not defile ourselves as we live for Christ. We'll go into chapter 2 of Daniel soon. And then in chapter 2, we're going to see this image of all of the world ruling empires of all time. And that really, again, kind of lays out this time period right now of what we're in, of the time of the church. So chapter 1 is the view as of a believer in the church age, and chapter 2 is really all of these world kingdoms, all of these unbelievers. And that ends with the kingdom. Well, chapter 3 is an interesting one, because in chapter 3 of Daniel, we see in that chapter, it's the only chapter in the book, Daniel's not in it. He's not there. And yet what the chapter is about his friends that go through the fiery furnace, his Jewish friends go through the fiery furnace. And that's a great example of what the tribulation is. Daniel, the believer that we're introduced to here in chapter 1, chapter 2, he's not there. It's like he's raptured out. And yet the Jewish boys go through the fire, through the tribulation, the testing. And of course, we know that they're actually sealed and protected through the fire. We'll get to that story in chapter 3. And then chapter 4 of Daniel, I feel like I'm giving away the whole book to you, but I want to set this up just this one time here. Chapter 4 of Daniel is a chapter all about the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and he is put out to the field. He goes crazy for a period of 7s. And he's mad for this whole time, and he's not in charge. And then at the end of that period of 7s, he comes back back into his right mind. But that chapter 4, with the king being bound, you could say, bound as an animal, lines up with the next prophetic step. What happens during the 1,000-year millennial kingdom of Satan? He's bound. He's bound for that 1,000 years, just as we see by imagery in Daniel chapter 4. Now, chapter 5 of Daniel brings us the last king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's passed, and then one of the next rulers is on the throne. So in chapter 5, the Babylonian kingdom is at its last legs. And we see in chapter 5, the king of Babylon drags all the rulers of the world and gathers them to himself for one last time, only to be overthrown that very night. And that's exactly what happens. Don't we know that from the book of Revelation? At the end of the 1,000-year kingdom, what happens? Satan is loosed from being bound, and he gathers all the lords of the earth together that want to rebel for one last rebellion, and the Lord puts them down, just as we see by imagery in Daniel chapter 5. And then finally, the very last chronological section of the book of Daniel, it's chapter 6, and what do we see? What do we see? We see a new kingdom. The Babylonians are done, and we have the Medo-Persians that take over. And in Daniel chapter 6, the Medo-Persians take charge. And one of the most fascinating things you'll see about the Medo-Persians, you see it in the book of Esther, you see it in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and we'll get it touched on here in the book of Daniel. It constantly says, the law of the Medo-Persians changes not. Do you remember in the time of Esther? What happened in the time of Esther when Haman got that law passed that said that everybody could go out and murder the Jews? How did they fix it? Do you remember that account? How did they fix that? Did they say, oh, well, let's just take that law back? They couldn't do that. Exactly. They had to pass a new law, another law saying the Jews were allowed to defend themselves. Because the standard in this new kingdom, and again, the Medo-Persians, I think, are just an earthly example of, they're just an earthly picture of, so the pictures are never perfect. But that the one thing that stands out about the Medo-Persians, about Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and here in Daniel, is it constantly says the law of the Medo-Persians changeth not. And that's a perfect image. It's not that it is the eternal state, but it's the perfect earthly image of the everlasting state in the end, when we will be living in the everlasting state in which it cannot change. We are there, and we are there for good. And so I wanted to give you a kind of a long introduction tonight to make the point that as we're going through these first 6 chapters of Daniel, I believe the Lord put them here in this order on purpose. He orchestrates Daniel's life in such a way that he perfectly role models by imagery and by type and by picture exactly what's coming soon to a theater near you. And so there you go, is a little bit of an outline. Now, we're going to get to the second half of Daniel in chapters 7 through 12. And it's written very much how Eastern or Hebrew poetry would be written, in that now the second half of the book, chapter 7 through 12, it goes back and it fills in the blank. It goes back and gives you more detail. Just like Genesis 1, it gives you the account. Oh, and then Genesis 2, well, it just fills in more details. And that's how the entire second half of the book of Daniel is. It will go and give us further details to events in Daniel's life. Does that make sense? Okay. So with that very long introduction, our outline tonight is really going to tackle looking at the devotional side of Daniel's life. We're going to see 4 ways in which we can show our commitment to Christ in the midst of corruption. Because didn't we say in our outline that that's what chapter 1 really is? It's showing us how Daniel, as a believer, can live an undefiled life in the midst of a corrupt universe, kingdom, whatever you're around. And he's certainly in a corrupt environment, nation, kingdom. And so we're gonna get some lessons from Daniel on how we can stay committed to Christ and stay undefiled, even though there's corruption all around. Sound good? All right, well, let's do it. We're going to begin now in earnest in verse 3. And our first point we're going to really raise here, the first way Daniel shows commitment to Christ in an ungodly place is that he is clearly committed to having godly character. He is one that understands the need of an inward heart for Christ. And it's just these first couple of verses, starting in verse 3, and it says this. Then the king said to Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, and you might have the word eunuchs right there. That's probably a good word. the king said to Ashpenaz, the head of the eunuchs, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal seed, or some of the king's descendants, and of the nobles. And in verse 4, bring in some of the youths, in whom was no defect, who were good in appearance, showing insight in every branch of wisdom, being thoroughly knowledgeable and discerning knowledge, and who had ability to stand in the king's palace. In other words, they had presence. They had presence. They had the ability, they weren't going to shy away to a corner. And he said for him to teach them the literature and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Now, we've already had a couple of terms here I want to get out of the way. We talked about how they brought the vessels from the temple to the land of Shinar. That is, if you think of Babylon as the city, okay, and they took their empire's name from the city of Babylon, okay? Everything that they possessed, they called the Babylonian Empire. But the region, you might say the state around the city of Babylon, was known as Shinar. And that's where that word comes from. Now, it says in end of verse 4, he said for them to teach these boys the literature and the tongue of the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were ancient inhabitants of this land of Shinar. That's who they were. So we don't really have in America a good comparison to that. We don't really have people groups that have just been in Chambersburg for 4,000 years or something like that. But over there, these Chaldeans were people that were known to be historical, ancestral to that land of Shinar since ancient times, as opposed to many other peoples that get intermixed and interbred and moving around and things like that. So these Chaldeans were known as ancient people from that very land. So who is it that Daniel and these other men get entrusted to? It's Ashpenaz, who is the head of these eunuchs. Most likely the word eunuch is intended to be eunuch. Most of these kingdoms of all times back then, they would intentionally have the high magistrates castrated on purpose so that would avoid distractions of all kinds. And so indeed, many people think that all of these young men, even from Judah, like Daniel, would have also been made a eunuch. So they wanted complete control over the people. That's what they're after. We'll get into this more next week in chapter 2, but Babylon specifically was an absolute dictatorship. It wasn't a partial dictatorship. It wasn't like you could talk him out of stuff. It was the most pure form of dictatorship there could have been. And he wanted absolute control. So this now in verse 3 and 4, particularly verse 4, all of these things, they were looking for young men that already had the ability to learn and the discernment and the ability to stand in the king's palace. They wanted people that they could utilize to one day be examples to tell everybody else in Babylon that, look, we brought these boys in, we taught them our language, and they love it here. They love it here. They wanted them to be poster children that they could use to say, see, we're not evil dictators. We really want to help you. Look at these young Jewish boys, and we raised them up and we made them into amazing Babylonian citizens. That's what they're after. Make no mistake about it. This is all politics. They want to be able to go to the next city they want to conquer, and they want to say, listen, we don't need to attack you. Just come under us. We'll raise up your young men just like this, and it'll be wonderful. That's what they're after here. They have no direct intention to, help Daniel and these other Jews. They're intentionally targeting the kids. Sound familiar? I sure hope it does, because this has been a worldwide tactic of all time. If you want to convince somebody of something, start with the kids. Adolf Hitler famously said that. He said, give me control of the textbooks and I will control the world. How's that? And that's what he's talking about, the school textbooks. I want to give you another one that I think is very interesting. This is still Satan's playbook, even to this day. Here's a quote by Richard Dawkins as it relates to teaching the lie of evolution. He said this, so I would teach evolution very early in childhood. I don't think it's all that difficult to do. It's a very simple idea. One could do it with the aid of computer games and things like that. I think it needs serious attention that children should be taught where they came from, what life is all about, how it started, why it's there, why there's such diversity of it, why it looks designed. Listen to him. These are all things that can easily be explained to a pretty young child. I'd start at the age of about 7 or 8. And so we have to recognize that. We're going to have a VBS coming up later this year. We're doing the same thing. We're going to target the kids because we believe they're impressionable and we want to get them saved. We want them to come to know Christ.
You've been listening to Believing the Word, a ministry of author and pastor Dan Shunk at Calvary Chapel Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Pastor Dan has been teaching through a series in the book of Daniel. We'd love to get connected with you and hear about how God is working in your life through this teaching program. You can reach us by phone at 717-500-1102. Again, that number is 717-500-1102. You can also check out our website at cchambersburg.org, where you can learn more about the ministry of Calvary Chapel Chambersburg and find our chapter-by-chapter messages. If you're in the Chambersburg area, we'd love to have you join us Sunday mornings and Thursday evenings on 5121 Coffee Avenue. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back with more from the book of Daniel. But until then, this has been Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.